Ambassador Zethkar's crystalline form trembled as he reviewed the intelligence reports for the third time. The holographic displays floating around his ornate chamber showed the same terrifying data each time he accessed them. Humanity had just destroyed an entire Krillian battle fleet using tactics that defied every known principle of civilized warfare. The Galactic Assembly had been monitoring the Sol system for decades, watching these strange bipedal creatures evolve from primitive tool users to spacefaring beings. Most species required millennia to develop faster than light travel, yet humans had accomplished it in mere centuries. What truly disturbed the Assembly was not their rapid technological advancement, but their approach to conflict resolution. Every civilized species in the galaxy followed the sacred protocols of war. Battles were conducted with honor, using predetermined formations and allowing enemy vessels to surrender when their shields dropped below 30%. Civilian populations were never targeted, and wars concluded with formal ceremonies where the losing side offered tribute to the victors. These traditions had maintained galactic peace for over 10,000 years. Humans apparently had never received this manual. The Krillian Empire had made first contact with humanity 6 months ago, expecting the usual diplomatic dance of territorial negotiations and trade agreements. Instead, they encountered a species that asked uncomfortable questions about their slave labor operations on mining worlds. When the Krillians dismissed human concerns and demanded tribute as was customary for newly contacted primitive species, the humans had done something unprecedented. They said no. Not only had they refused to pay tribute, but they had also declared the Krillian slave operations a crime against sentient life. The audacity shocked the entire assembly. A species barely capable of interstellar travel was challenging one of the galaxy's major powers over what they called basic morality. The Krillians, insulted beyond measure, had dispatched their 7th Fleet to teach these upstart Deathworlders a lesson in galactic hierarchy. 300 ships of the line, each the size of a small moon, had jumped into the Sol system expecting to find a few dozen primitive vessels defending their homeworld. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by what humans called asteroids. Zethkar pulled up the battle recordings again, his translator struggling with the human communications that had been intercepted. The Krillian admiral had demanded immediate surrender, explaining that resistance was futile against superior numbers and technology. The human response still sent chills through his exoskeleton. Admiral Chen to Krillian Fleet, "You have 10 seconds to reverse course and leave our system. This is your only warning." The arrogance had been staggering. 10 seconds? Against 300 ships? The Krillian admiral had laughed so hard his gills had fluttered, broadcasting his amusement across all frequencies for the galaxy to hear. He had begun powering up his weapons when something impossible happened. The asteroids moved. What the Krillians had assumed were natural space debris were actually human vessels, each one disguised using techniques that baffled the Assembly's best scientists. Hundreds of ships had been lying dormant, perfectly camouflaged as cosmic rock, waiting with patience that no civilized species possessed. The humans had somehow predicted exactly where the Krillian fleet would drop out of hyperspace and had prepared an ambush 3 months in advance. But the real horror had come with their choice of weapons. Instead of the traditional energy beams that allowed for shields and defensive maneuvering, humans used kinetic projectiles accelerated to significant fractions of light speed. Chunks of metal and rock that punched through shields like they were made of tissue paper. The Krillian ships, designed for honorable combat between equals, crumpled like paper containers under the relentless barrage. The battle had lasted exactly 17 minutes. Zethkar's attention shifted to the surrender recordings. Here, surely, the humans would display some measure of civilized behavior. Surely they would accept the Krillian offer of tribute and territorial concessions. Instead, Admiral Chen had delivered terms that sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. Release all slaves in your territories within 30 days. Provide full reparations to affected populations. Submit to monitoring by neutral parties to ensure compliance. Failure to meet any of these terms will result in the complete destruction of your military capabilities. The demands were impossible. The Krillian economy had been built on slave labor for centuries. Their entire social structure depended on the subjugation of lesser species. To comply would mean the end of their empire as they knew it. Yet as Zethkar watched the recordings of human ships systematically dismantling the survivors of the 7th Fleet, he realized these creatures meant every word. What terrified him most was not their military capability, but their motivation. Every species fought for territory, resources, or status. Humans appeared to be fighting for abstract concepts they called rights and dignity. They were willing to go to war over the treatment of species they had never met, on worlds they would never visit for no apparent gain. The Galactic Assembly had spent 3 days in emergency session, trying to categorize this new threat. Military analysts had dissected every second of the battle, searching for weaknesses in human tactics. Cultural experts had studied their intercepted communications, attempting to understand their motivations. Xenobiologists had examined what little data they possessed about human physiology and psychology. The conclusions were unanimous and terrifying. Humans were a species that had evolved on a world so hostile that simply surviving required them to develop capabilities that other species used for warfare. They possessed endurance that allowed them to pursue prey across vast distances until it collapsed from exhaustion. Their pattern recognition abilities were so advanced, they could identify threats and opportunities in chaotic environments. Most disturbing of all, they possessed something the Assembly's linguists could only translate as spite, mirror, willingness to accept personal loss in order to inflict greater damage on their enemies. As Zethkar prepared his report for the Assembly's Emergency Council, he found himself focusing on one particular intercepted human transmission. A junior officer had asked Admiral Chen why they were risking war with a galactic superpower over the fate of unknown alien slaves. Chen's response haunted the ambassador's dreams. Because if we don't stand up for them, who will? And if we let this slide, what does that make us? High Counselor Varthak's 4 eyes darted nervously between the assembled representatives as panicked voices filled the Grand Chamber. The emergency session had been called after. Reports confirmed that humans had not only defeated the Krillian 7th Fleet but had begun actively hunting down Krillian slave operations throughout 3-star systems. The hegemony representative, a massive crustacean-like being named Clickstar, slammed his armored claws against his speaking podium. This cannot be allowed to continue. The humans are disrupting trade routes that have operated peacefully for millennia. They board our vessels demanding to inspect cargo holds for what they call trafficked persons. The audacity is beyond comprehension. A chorus of agreement rippled through the chamber. The Veltarian delegate, her serpentine body coiled anxiously around her floating platform, added her voice to the complaints. 3 of our mining colonies have been forcibly liberated by human strike teams. They arrived without warning, destroyed our security forces, and simply freed the workers. When our corporate representatives demanded compensation for lost property, the humans stated that sentient beings cannot be owned. The economic implications are staggering. Varthak studied the tactical displays surrounding his central dais. Red warning markers indicated human activity across 17 different systems. In each case, the pattern was identical. Human ships would appear as if from nowhere, moving with a coordination that suggested hive mind intelligence. They would identify targets with impossible accuracy, strike with overwhelming force, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The Thraxian military advisor, General Korth, had spent weeks analyzing human combat recordings. His species had conquered 47 worlds using traditional tactics, earning them respect throughout the galaxy. Yet, as he addressed the assembly, his voice carried an unfamiliar tremor of uncertainty. Honored counselors, we must acknowledge that humanity employs warfare concepts completely foreign to civilized thinking. They do not announce their intentions, allowing enemies time to prepare defenses. They do not engage in single combat between champions to determine outcomes. Instead, they attack simultaneously from multiple vectors, using what they term combined arms to overwhelm specific points of resistance. The general activated a holographic display showing the liberation of the Veltarian mining colony designated as Extraction Site Gamma 9. Observe their methodology. While we focused on the obvious threat of their warships in orbit, human ground forces had already infiltrated the facility through abandoned thermal vents. They disabled security systems from within, while their ships provided precision bombardment of strategic targets. The entire operation lasted 43 minutes, during which they evacuated over 10,000 enslaved workers, while suffering 0 casualties. Murmurs of disbelief echoed through the chamber. 0 casualties in a military operation was unprecedented. Either humans possessed technology far beyond galactic standards, or their tactical thinking operated on principles that civilized minds could not comprehend. The Krillian Emperor himself had requested permission to address the assembly via quantum entanglement communication. His image materialized above the central platform, the once proud ruler now bearing visible signs of stress. His bioluminescent patches flickered erratically as he spoke. Esteemed colleagues, humanity has delivered an ultimatum that threatens the foundation of our civilization. They demand the immediate release of all workers they classify as slaves, despite these individuals being legally acquired through proper conquest and purchase. They have established what they call monitoring stations in our space, watching our every movement. When we attempted to relocate certain valuable assets to more secure facilities, human ships intercepted our convoys and liberated the cargo. The Emperor's image wavered as his emotional state affected the transmission. But the true horror lies in their recruitment methods. They do not simply free our workers and abandon them. Instead, they offer these individuals something no civilized species would consider. They offer them membership in the human military forces. Former slaves are being trained to use human weapons and tactics. They are creating an army of beings who possess intimate knowledge of our operations and infrastructure. This revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. The concept of arming former slaves was so radical that most species lacked words to describe it. Throughout galactic history, freed slaves either returned to their homeworlds or accepted permanent status as protected refugees. The idea of transforming them into military assets was beyond conventional thinking. Ambassador Zethkar rose from his crystalline seat, his form shimmering with agitation. We must consider the psychological profiles our xenobiologists have compiled regarding human behavior. Unlike species that evolved as prey animals or natural pacifists, humans descended from persistence predators. Their ancestors survived by tracking prey across vast distances, wearing them down through relentless pursuit rather than overwhelming force. He gestured to display a three-dimensional map of recent human activities. Notice the pattern of their operations. They are not seeking territory or resources in any traditional sense. Instead, they appear to be conducting what they term a moral crusade. Each liberated population becomes a source of intelligence regarding other slave operations. Each successful rescue provides them with allies who possess knowledge of our military capabilities and economic infrastructure. The hegemony representative interrupted with obvious frustration. But what do they want? Every species can be negotiated with if you understand their motivations. We have offered territorial concessions, exclusive trade agreements, and access to rare technologies. They reject every proposal and continue their interference with lawful commercial activities. Varthak had been studying intercepted human communications for weeks, searching for clues to their ultimate objectives. What he had discovered defied everything the assembly understood about interstellar politics. He activated his personal display, showing a compilation of human military communications. The answer lies in their own words, though I confess the concepts are difficult for civilized minds to process. In their internal discussions, humans use phrases like moral imperative and universal rights. They appear to believe that certain principles apply to all sentient life, regardless of species or political affiliation. When their Admiral Chen was asked by his subordinates why humans should risk war with multiple galactic powers, his response was that failing to act would make them complicit in atrocities. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Humans were not seeking conquest, territory, or resources. They were fighting for abstract principles that required them to interfere with the internal affairs of every other species in the galaxy. There could be no negotiation because they would never accept any agreement that permitted what they considered injustice. General Korth's tactical analysis had reached the same disturbing conclusion. Honored counselors, we face an enemy that cannot be defeated through conventional military means because they do not fight for conventional objectives. They possess technological capabilities that suggest advanced industrial capacity, but more importantly, they demonstrate strategic patience that indicates long-term planning across multiple generations. The general's final statement sent chills through every representative present. Based on their current operational tempo and expansion patterns, human forces will contact every major slave-holding operation in the galaxy within 18 months. We are not facing a traditional military threat. We are facing what humans themselves would call a revolution. Captain Sarah Chen reviewed the intelligence reports streaming across her command display as the UES Righteous Fury drifted silently through the asteroid field surrounding Kepler Station. 3 months had passed since humanity's first contact with the Galactic Assembly, and each week brought new evidence of systematic oppression that demanded intervention. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Okafor, highlighted the next target on their operational map. Captain, we've confirmed the location of what the locals call the processing center on Terminus 7. Intelligence estimates indicate approximately 50,000 beings from 12 different species being held in forced labor conditions. Chen studied the facility schematics that had been provided by recently liberated Veltarian refugees. The orbital station represented everything wrong with galactic civilization, a massive industrial complex where sentient beings were treated as disposable machinery. According to intercepted communications, workers who became injured or sick were simply ejected into space to reduce maintenance costs. "What's our opposition looking like?" Chen asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. 3 hegemony cruisers and a defensive platform mounting standard energy weapons. Based on previous encounters, they'll likely attempt to hail us with demands for identification and departure once we're detected. Standard procedure appears to be a 15-minute warning period before they begin firing. Chen almost smiled at the predictability of galactic military doctrine. Every species they had encountered followed the same ritualized approach to warfare. Formal challenges, predetermined formations, and weapons that prioritize spectacle over effectiveness. It was as if the entire galaxy had agreed that combat should resemble an elaborate dance, rather than a serious attempt to destroy one's enemies. Signal, the determination, and the perseverance. "We'll use the Mozambique protocol. I want those cruisers disabled before they realize we're not playing by their rules." The bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency as Chen's ship and her 2 escorts prepared for what humans had begun calling a liberation operation. Unlike galactic standard practice, human tactics emphasize speed, surprise, and overwhelming force applied at critical points. They had learned these lessons fighting each other for thousands of years on a world that considered warfare a matter of species survival. Chief Petty Officer Williams, a former slave who had been liberated from a Krillian mining operation 6 weeks earlier, served as cultural liaison for the mission. His insights into galactic slave operations had proven invaluable in planning rescue operations. Despite being offered civilian status and passage to any world he chose, Williams had insisted on joining the human military to help free others in similar situations. "Captain," Williams said, his translated voice carrying the formal tones his species used for serious matters. "The processing center uses psychological conditioning that may make some workers resistant to liberation. They are taught that resistance will result in collective punishment of their work groups. We may need to demonstrate that human protection is absolute before they will trust us." This had become a recurring challenge in human operations. Many liberated beings initially feared that helping their rescuers would result in retaliation against family members or colleagues still held in bondage. Humans had developed specific protocols to address these concerns, but each species required different approaches based on their psychology and cultural background. "Understood. We'll follow the Manila procedure for initial contact. Full shield demonstration, then immediate deployment of protection. Details to secure all work areas simultaneously." The Manila procedure had been developed after a tragic incident where newly liberated workers had been killed by automated security systems during a rescue operation. Human military doctrine now required absolute control of hostile facilities before beginning evacuation procedures. No one would be freed only to die from delayed traps or revenge killings. As the Righteous Fury accelerated toward its target, Chen reflected on how much human thinking had evolved since first contact. Initially, military planners had expected to find a galaxy full of species similar to themselves, competitive, aggressive, and constantly testing each other's strength. Instead, they had discovered a civilization built on the systematic exploitation of the weak by the strong, maintained through traditions that prevented effective resistance. The discovery had triggered what historians would later call the Great Awakening in human consciousness. For the first time in their species' history, humans possessed both the power and the opportunity to end suffering on a galactic scale. The moral implications had sparked debates in every government, university, and religious institution on Earth. The consensus had been unprecedented in human history. This was a responsibility they could not ignore. "Contact in 30 seconds. Captain," reported the navigation officer. "Hegemony forces are maintaining standard patrol patterns. No indication they've detected our approach." Chen activated the ship's communication systems, preparing to deliver the ultimatum that had become standard in human operations. She had modified the wording slightly for this mission, incorporating suggestions from liberated beings who understood the psychological impact of different phrasings on various species. "Hegemony forces. This is Captain Chen of the United Earthship Righteous Fury. You are operating a facility that violates the Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. You have 60 seconds to begin evacuation procedures for all workers and surrender operational control of the station. Compliance will ensure the safety of your personnel. Resistance will result in the complete destruction of your military assets." The response came exactly as predicted. The Hegemony commander demanded identification, threatened dire consequences for unauthorized presence in their territory, and began the ritual process of forming his ships into traditional battle formation. He allocated precisely 15 minutes for diplomatic posturing. Before combat would begin, he had 47 seconds before human weapons opened fire. The engagement demonstrated everything that separated human military, thinking from galactic standards. Instead of announcing their attack with energy weapon signatures that could be detected and countered, human ships used kinetic projectiles that appeared on sensors only microseconds before impact. Instead of targeting enemy weapons to disable them honorably, humans aimed for propulsion systems and command centers to eliminate the vessel's ability to coordinate resistance. The 3 Hegemony cruisers were crippled and helpless within 90 seconds of the first shot. While the space battle concluded, human assault teams were already boarding the processing center through maintenance airlocks that Galactic security had never considered vulnerable. The station's defenders found themselves facing soldiers who moved through the facility as if they had trained there for months, striking simultaneously at security stations, communication centers, and worker containment areas. What followed was controlled chaos as 50,000 beings discovered that rescue was not only possible, but had actually arrived. Human soldiers, many of them former slaves themselves, moved through the crowds with translators and emergency supplies, explaining that they were safe and that no retaliation was possible. Captain Chen monitored the operation from her command center, watching as another piece of the galactic slave system crumbled before human determination. Each successful mission provided intelligence for the next target, while each liberated being became a potential ally in the growing struggle for universal freedom. As the last transport shuttle departed the now empty processing center, Chen received a message that had become routine in recent weeks. The Galactic Assembly was demanding an immediate ceasefire and negotiations to resolve what they termed the human situation. The message included increasingly desperate offers of territory, technology, and trade agreements in exchange for human withdrawal from what they considered internal galactic affairs. Chen deleted the message without reading the details. Humans had already made their position clear, and no amount of negotiation would change it. The galaxy would be free, or humanity would die trying to make it so. Fleet Admiral Marcus Rodriguez stood before the holographic display in the U.S. Liberation Strategy Center, watching real-time updates from 17 simultaneous operations across the galaxy. 6 months after humanity's first intervention, the scope of their campaign had expanded beyond anything the Galactic Assembly could have imagined. What had begun as isolated rescue missions had evolved into a coordinated assault on the foundations of galactic civilization. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the fleet's chief xenopsychologist, approached with the latest intelligence analysis. Her team had been working around the clock to understand the psychological impact of human operations on both freed populations and their former captors. The data painted a picture of a galaxy in the grip of fundamental transformation. "Admiral, we're seeing cascade effects that our initial models didn't predict," she reported, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and concern. "Each liberation operation is triggering spontaneous uprisings in nearby systems. Word is spreading faster than we can operate, and enslaved populations are beginning to resist their captors without our direct intervention." Rodriguez studied the spreading pattern of rebellion markers across the galactic map. Red zones indicated active human operations, but increasingly yellow markers showed independent resistance movements that had emerged without human contact. The psychological impact of humanity's campaign was proving as powerful as their military capabilities. "What's the Assembly's response been?" he asked, though intelligence reports had already provided disturbing insights into their deliberations. "They're fragmenting, sir. 3 major trading consortiums have already announced voluntary manumission of their slave populations, rather than face human intervention. The Veltarian Corporate Collective has converted 17 facilities to paid labor operations, but the hardliners are organizing something they're calling the Stability Coalition, a military alliance specifically designed to counter human expansion. This development had been anticipated by human strategic planners. The galaxy's power structure could not simply accept the end of slavery without attempting to preserve their dominance through military means. Intelligence suggested that nearly 40 species had committed warships to a massive fleet being assembled in the Centaurus sector. Commander Lisa Park, Rodriguez's tactical advisor, highlighted the enemy force composition on the central display. "We're looking at approximately 4,000 ships representing the largest military alliance in recorded galactic history. They're using traditional formation tactics, but the sheer numerical advantage is concerning. Their strategy appears to focus on overwhelming our forces through coordinated mass engagement." Rodriguez examined the enemy formations with interest rather than concern. Human military analysts had spent months studying galactic warfare tactics, and the patterns were remarkably consistent across species. Large formations moving in predictable patterns, energy weapons that provided significant warning before firing, and command structures that required extensive communication between vessels. "They're still thinking like this is a traditional territorial war," he observed. "Deploy the distributed doctrine. I want our forces scattered across 30 different systems. Make them choose between defending their remaining slave operations or concentrating their fleet for a single engagement. They can't afford to lose." The distributed doctrine represented everything that separated human strategic thinking from galactic standards. Instead of massing their forces for decisive battle, humans had chosen to maintain constant pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously. Their ships operated independently or in small groups, striking targets of opportunity while avoiding the massive set-piece battles that galactic commanders expected. The strategy was psychologically devastating for their enemies. Traditional galactic warfare followed predictable patterns that allowed both sides to prepare for major engagements with appropriate ceremony and honor. Human forces appeared and disappeared without warning, struck at unexpected targets, and refused to engage in the formal challenges that preceded civilized warfare. Chief Warrant Officer Karath, a liberated Krillian who had become one of humanity's most effective intelligence operatives, approached with an urgent communication intercept. His unique perspective as a former slave had proven invaluable in understanding the psychological warfare aspects of their campaign. "Admiral, we've intercepted Assembly communications regarding what they're calling the Deathworlder problem. Their xenobiologists have completed analysis of human evolutionary history, and the results are causing panic in their leadership circles." Rodriguez accepted the translated document with curiosity. Human scientists had provided similar analyses to their own military planners, but seeing their species through alien eyes offered interesting perspectives on their own capabilities. The report was fascinating in its clinical assessment of human psychology. Assembly scientists had identified humans as persistence predators, whose ancestors had survived by tracking prey across vast distances until exhaustion forced surrender. This evolutionary heritage had produced a species capable of maintaining pressure against enemies indefinitely, never allowing them to rest or recover. More disturbing to galactic minds was the human concept of righteous anger, an emotional state that actually improved their combat effectiveness rather than impairing it. Most species experience decreased cognitive function when emotionally aroused, but humans demonstrated enhanced focus and determination when fighting for causes they considered morally justified. The report's conclusion was particularly revealing. Humans appear incapable of accepting defeat when fighting for abstract principles they classify as moral imperatives. Traditional negotiation strategies are ineffective because they do not recognize any authority higher than their own ethical standards. Military solutions are problematic because their combat effectiveness increases proportionally to the perceived injustice of their opposition. Dr. Vasquez reviewed the psychological profiles with professional interest. This explains why their offers of territorial concessions and trade agreements have been ignored. Human political philosophy apparently includes concepts they translate as inalienable rights that cannot be negotiated away under any circumstances. The implications were staggering for galactic civilization. Every previous conflict had been resolved through compromise, with both sides accepting reduced versions of their original objectives. Humans appeared to be fighting for goals that were either completely achieved or completely failed. There was no middle ground acceptable to their species. A priority communication alert interrupted their analysis. Captain Chen's task force had just completed the liberation of the hegemony's primary processing facility in the core worlds, freeing over 200,000 beings from what amounted to industrial slavery. More significantly, they had captured detailed records of every slave operation in the sector. Admiral, Captain Chen's image appeared in the communication display. We've acquired intelligence that changes everything. The Assembly isn't just tolerating slavery. They've built their entire economic system around it. Energy production, food processing, mineral extraction, even their transportation networks depend on forced labor. Liberation isn't just freeing individuals anymore. We're looking at the collapse of galactic civilization as they know it. Rodriguez studied the captured data streams showing the true scope of galactic slavery. Hundreds of billions of sentient beings trapped in conditions that made historical human slavery seem humane by comparison. Entire species bred specifically for industrial labor. Their lifespans artificially shortened to maximize productivity. Worlds where the concept of freedom had been systematically eliminated from cultural memory. The scale of suffering was beyond anything human history had prepared them to confront. Yet as Rodriguez looked around at his multinational, multi-species crew, humans, working alongside beings they had liberated from bondage, he felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven his species to challenge an entire galaxy. Signal. All task forces, he commanded. Phase 2 is authorized. We're not just liberating individuals anymore. We're liberating an entire galaxy, whether they want it or not. The Stability Coalition's 4,000 ships represented the last desperate attempt to preserve a system that had oppressed countless billions for millennia. Against them stood barely 300 human vessels and their growing alliance of liberated beings. By every conventional measure, the outcome should have been predetermined. But humans had never been particularly concerned with conventional measures. High Admiral Zexthor of the Stability Coalition stared at the tactical display in growing disbelief as another of his battle groups simply vanished from the sensor grid. In 3 weeks of what should have been decisive military action against the human insurgency, his massive fleet had been systematically dismantled without engaging in a single major battle. The coalition's war plan had been elegant in its simplicity. 4,000 ships divided into 8 battle groups would simultaneously strike major human bases while protecting key slave facilities. The overwhelming numerical superiority would force humans into defensive positions where traditional galactic warfare tactics would prove decisive. Victory should have been achieved within days. Instead, Zexthor found himself commanding a fleet that was being hunted across multiple star systems by an enemy that refused to fight, according to civilized standards. Status. Report, he demanded from his intelligence coordinator, though each update brought worse news than the last. Admiral, Battle Group 7 ceased communications 47 minutes ago, while investigating reported human activity in the Rigel sector. Long-range sensors detected weapons fire consistent with human kinetic projectiles, but no enemy vessels were observed in the area. Zexthor's gill slits fluttered with frustration. This had become the pattern of human operations. Coalition forces would receive intelligence about human activity, proceed to investigate using standard formation tactics, and then disappear entirely. Survivors were rare, and their reports described attacks that seemed to come from empty space itself. What about our defensive assignments? Surely the humans must be targeting the facilities we're protecting. The intelligence coordinator's response confirmed Zexthor's worst fears. Sir, 15 more processing centers have been liberated in the past 72 hours, none of them defended by coalition forces. The humans appear to be ignoring our fleet positions entirely, and striking targets were not prepared to defend. This violated every principle of rational military strategy. Conventional warfare doctrine required engaging and defeating enemy forces before attempting to secure territorial objectives. Humans seemed to treat enemy fleets as irrelevant obstacles rather than primary targets, striking wherever coalition defenses were weakest while avoiding areas where major battles might develop. General Korth, the coalition's chief military strategist, had spent weeks attempting to predict human movements using traditional tactical analysis. His efforts had been consistently frustrated by human willingness to ignore strategic objectives that any civilized commander would consider essential. Admiral, our tactical computers have analyzed every human operation in their database. The patterns are unlike anything in recorded military history. They prioritize target value based on criteria that appear to be moral rather than strategic. Facilities with the worst working conditions are attacked first, regardless of their military importance or defensive strength. Zexthor studied the pattern of human strikes across the galaxy. Major industrial centers with strong defenses remained untouched, while smaller facilities with weaker security had been systematically liberated. The humans were fighting a war where enemy suffering took priority over territorial gain. More disturbing was the psychological impact of human operations on coalition forces. Traditional galactic warfare involved formal challenges, predetermined battle sites, and mutual agreement on acceptable losses. Humans struck without warning, disappeared before reinforcements could arrive, and left behind evidence of combat efficiency that demoralized entire fleet divisions. A priority communication from the Hegemony High Command interrupted his tactical analysis. The message carried authorization codes that indicated direct involvement from the Assembly's ruling council. Admiral Zexthor, you are ordered to implement Protocol 7 immediately. The Coalition cannot sustain current loss rates while achieving negligible strategic objectives. Protocol 7 was the galactic equivalent of total war, the abandonment of civilized restraints in favor of maximum destruction. It authorized targeting of civilian populations, destruction of infrastructure, and the use of weapons considered too destructive for honorable warfare. The protocol had not been implemented in over 3,000 years. Sir, General Korth said quietly, Protocol 7 specifically includes authorization for planetary bombardment of worlds harboring human sympathizers. The Assembly appears to believe that terror tactics will force human withdrawal. Zexthor considered the implications of this escalation. Protocol 7 would transform their conflict from a military operation into what humans would undoubtedly classify as genocide. Yet his current tactical situation offered few alternatives. Conventional military action had proven ineffective against enemies who refused to engage in conventional warfare. Identify target systems with significant populations of liberated slaves. Will demonstrate that harboring human allies carries unacceptable consequences. The order represented everything wrong with galactic civilization that had motivated human intervention. Rather than addressing the moral questions raised by their slave-based economy, the Assembly had chosen to double down on oppression through systematic terror. They would massacre innocent populations to preserve their right to massacre innocent populations. What Zexthor did not realize was that human intelligence had been monitoring coalition communications since the beginning of the conflict. Every order, every strategic discussion, and every tactical analysis had been intercepted and analyzed by human cryptographers. The decision to implement Protocol 7 had been anticipated and prepared for it. Admiral Rodriguez received the intelligence briefing aboard the UES Liberation while coordinating rescue operations in the Vega sector. The content was disturbing but not surprising. Humans had studied galactic history extensively and understood that civilizations built on oppression would ultimately resort to genocide when their power was threatened. Signal all task forces, Rodriguez commanded. The gloves are off. Implement the Nuremberg Protocol immediately. The Nuremberg Protocol represented humanity's response to what they classified as crimes against sentience, named after the historical trials that had established the principle of universal justice. The protocol authorized immediate and overwhelming retaliation against any forces targeting civilian populations. Unlike galactic warfare, which focused on defeating enemy military assets while preserving their capability to surrender honorably, The Nuremberg Protocol treated war crimes as forfeitures of combatant status. Forces implementing Protocol 7 would be hunted down and destroyed without opportunity for surrender. Captain Chen received the new operational parameters while her task force monitored coalition movements in the Perseus arm. Her orders were specific and uncompromising. Any coalition vessel involved in planetary bombardment was to be eliminated with extreme prejudice. No warnings, no opportunities for surrender, no consideration for traditional battlefield honors. All ships, this is actual, she broadcast to her assembled fleet. The enemy has chosen to target civilians rather than face us in honest combat. As of now, we are no longer bound by the restraints we have placed on ourselves. These people want to see what human warfare really looks like when we stop being polite about it. The response from her multinational, multi-species crew was immediate and unanimous. Humans had been fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, following rules of engagement designed to minimize casualties and preserve enemy infrastructure. Those restraints had just been removed. What followed would be remembered as the 72-hour war, though historians would debate whether the term war adequately described what humans did to the Stability Coalition. In less than 3 days, 4,000 ships representing the largest military alliance in galactic history simply ceased to exist. The Coalition's first attempt to implement Protocol 7 provided humans with the justification they needed to abandon every restraint they had imposed on themselves. Ships that had been hiding among asteroids and debris fields revealed themselves as purpose-built instruments of destruction. Weapons that had been carefully calibrated to disable rather than destroy were reconfigured for maximum lethality. Most importantly, human forces stopped fighting like a liberation army and started fighting like the apex predators their evolution had produced. The galaxy was about to learn why humans had spent thousands of years developing increasingly efficient methods of killing each other, and why that experience made them uniquely qualified to end oppression wherever they found it. The emergency session of the Galactic Assembly convened in chaos as reports streamed in from across the galaxy. High Counselor Varthak's crystalline form trembled uncontrollably as he processed the catastrophic intelligence updates. In 72 hours, the largest military alliance in galactic history had been completely annihilated by human forces that seemed to appear from the very fabric of space itself. Ambassador Zethkar stood before the assembled representatives, his usual diplomatic composure shattered by the reports he was forced to deliver. The holographic displays surrounding the chamber showed the aftermath of what humans had designated as the 72-hour war, a conflict that had redefined everyone's understanding of what warfare could become. Honored delegates, Zethkar began, his voice barely controlled. I must report that the Stability Coalition no longer exists as a military entity. All 4,000 vessels have been destroyed or captured. High Admiral Zexthor's flagship was found drifting in space with its entire crew missing, apparently removed through transportation methods we cannot comprehend. The silence that followed was broken by Counselor Velthara's serpentine form rising from her platform. How is this possible? Our combined fleets represented the accumulated military might of 47 civilizations. Human forces numbered fewer than 400 vessels. General Korth, one of the few military advisors to survive the Coalition's destruction, had spent 3 days analyzing battle recordings in an attempt to understand what had happened. His report challenged every assumption about human military capabilities that the Assembly had developed. Honorable Assembly, we have been fundamentally mistaken about human military doctrine. We assumed they were using primitive kinetic weapons because they lacked access to advanced energy systems. Analysis of the recent battles indicates that their weapon choices were deliberately optimized for fighting opponents using our defensive technologies. The General activated a holographic replay of the Coalition's final engagement. Observe the human attack on Battle Group 7. They did not engage our shields with energy weapons that could be deflected or absorbed. Instead, they used what they call relativistic kill vehicles, projectiles accelerated to significant fractions of light speed that simply ignore defensive measures entirely. The recording showed Coalition vessels attempting to maintain formation while human projectiles tore through their ranks like cosmic bullets. Energy shields that had protected galactic civilizations for millennia proved useless against weapons that converted matter directly into destructive force through kinetic energy alone. But the true revelation came when we analyzed their fleet movements, Korth continued. Humans were not hiding among asteroids because they lacked proper cloaking technology. They were using the asteroids themselves as weapons platforms, hollowing them out and installing propulsion systems that turned cosmic debris into guided missiles weighing millions of tons. The implications sent shockwaves through the assembly. Humans had been fighting with an entire solar system's worth of ammunition, turning every piece of space debris into a potential weapon. The Coalition's magnificent warships had been destroyed by rocks that moved faster than their sensors could track. Emperor Krextel of the Hegemony had requested emergency transportation to address the assembly personally. His arrival had been delayed by security concerns, as human forces had begun targeting government installations in addition to military assets. When his image finally appeared via quantum entanglement, his usual imperial bearing had been replaced by barely contained panic. Esteemed colleagues, humanity has issued what they call an unconditional surrender demand to every government in the galaxy. The terms are non-negotiable and must be implemented within 30 standard days. The Emperor activated a display showing the human ultimatum in its entirety. The document represented everything the Assembly feared about. Human political philosophy, demands that would fundamentally restructure galactic civilization according to alien moral principles, complete abolition of slavery in all forms, immediate release of all beings held in involuntary servitude, reparations to affected populations calculated at full market value for their lifetime labor, submission to human-supervised elections to establish representative governments for all previously enslaved populations. The demands were impossible to implement without destroying the economic and social structures that had defined galactic civilization for millennia. Yet as reports continued to arrive of human forces systematically eliminating any military resistance, the alternative appeared to be complete annihilation. Dr. Zerath, the Assembly's chief xenopsychologist, had been conducting emergency analysis of human behavioral patterns since the beginning of the conflict. Her findings painted a picture of a species operating according to psychological principles that civilized minds struggled to comprehend. Honored delegates, I must report that humans appear to be psychologically incapable of accepting compromise on what they classify as fundamental moral issues. Unlike civilized species that seek to minimize conflict through negotiated settlement, humans demonstrate increased aggression when fighting for abstract principles. Her analysis included intercepted communications from human military units that revealed the emotional state of their forces, rather than war weariness or desire for negotiated peace. Human personnel exhibited what their psychologists called righteous determination, a psychological condition that actually enhanced their combat effectiveness. Most disturbing is their concept of moral obligation, Dr. Zerath continued. Humans appear to believe they are personally responsible for ending suffering throughout the galaxy, even among species they have never encountered. This produces a willingness to accept massive personal sacrifice in pursuit of abstract ethical goals. The psychological profile explained why traditional diplomatic approaches had failed so completely. Humans were not fighting for territory, resources, or political advantage that could be negotiated. They were fighting for principles they considered absolute and universal, applicable to all sentient life regardless of species or cultural background. Ambassador Zethkar concluded his report with the most disturbing intelligence yet received. Honored colleagues, our monitoring stations have detected human fleet movements toward the core worlds. Their projected arrival time suggests they intend to blockade the assembly homeworlds within 2 weeks. Given their demonstrated capabilities, we must assume they possess the military capacity to enforce their ultimatum through direct action. The chamber erupted in panicked discussions as delegates realized the full scope of their predicament. The Assembly's primary worlds contained the largest slave populations in the galaxy, billions of beings whose liberation would trigger complete economic collapse. Yet resistance would mean facing enemies who had just demonstrated their ability to destroy 4,000 warships without suffering significant casualties. Counselor, Varthak called for order as he prepared to address the question that every delegate was afraid to voice. Honored Assembly, we must consider whether continued resistance serves any rational purpose. Human forces have demonstrated technological and tactical superiority that makes military victory impossible. Our choice appears to be between voluntary compliance with their demands or involuntary compliance after suffering additional, catastrophic losses. The statement that followed would be remembered as the moment Galactic civilization acknowledged its own moral bankruptcy. After thousands of years of systematic oppression justified by tradition and law, the Assembly was forced to confront the reality that their entire social structure had been built on principles that could not be defended when challenged by beings willing to fight for justice. The vote was taken in stunned silence. By a margin of 412 to 17 with 36 abstentions, the Galactic Assembly voted to accept unconditional surrender to humanity, rather than face the consequences of continued resistance. For the first time in galactic history, an entire civilization had capitulated not to superior force, but to superior moral conviction. The age of slavery was ending not because it was economically inefficient or politically unstable, but because beings from a distant world had decided it was simply wrong. 2 years after the Galactic Assembly's unconditional surrender, Fleet Admiral Rodriguez stood on the observation deck of the UES Liberation, watching the dedication ceremony for New Geneva Station. The massive orbital facility represented everything humanity had fought to achieve, a center of learning and cooperation built by free beings working together rather than slaves laboring under compulsion. The transformation had not been easy. Dismantling a slave-based economy that had operated for millennia required careful planning to prevent economic collapse that would harm the very populations they had fought to liberate. Human economists, working alongside representatives from hundreds of former slave species, had developed transition plans that provided support for newly freed beings while establishing sustainable economic alternatives. Dr. Elena Vasquez approached with the latest progress report from the Reconstruction Authority. Her xenopsychology team had been instrumental in developing rehabilitation programs for beings who had never known freedom, helping them adapt to concepts like self-determination and representative government. Admiral, we've reached a significant milestone. The last of the major processing centers has been converted to voluntary employment. Over 300 billion beings have completed transition from slave status to full citizenship in their respective systems. The numbers were staggering, even to those who had orchestrated the liberation. Entire species that had been bred for servitude were discovering art, philosophy, and scientific inquiry for the first time. Worlds that had known only industrial exploitation were developing cultures based on creativity rather than productivity quotas. Captain Chen materialized via holographic communication from her current assignment in the Outer Rim territories. Her task force had been investigating reports of isolated slave operations that had escaped initial liberation efforts, ensuring that no being remained in bondage anywhere in the galaxy. Admiral, I'm pleased to report that the Centauri sector is now completely clear. The last holdout facility surrendered without resistance once their personnel realized we weren't going to accept any form of forced labor, no matter how they tried to disguise it as voluntary service. The transition period had revealed the true scope of galactic slavery's psychological impact. Many former slaves initially refused freedom, having been conditioned to believe that independence was impossible or undesirable. Human rehabilitation specialists had worked tirelessly to undo centuries of psychological conditioning, teaching beings that they deserved dignity and self-determination. Ambassador Kareth, the former Krillian slave who had become one of humanity's most effective diplomatic representatives, entered the observation lounge with news from the Assembly's latest session. His transformation from industrial laborer to galactic statesman represented the potential that slavery had suppressed throughout the galaxy. Admiral, the Assembly has voted to ratify the Universal Rights Constitution. The final vote was unanimous, though I suspect some delegates were more motivated by practical considerations than moral conviction. The Universal Rights Constitution represented humanity's attempt to establish legal frameworks that would prevent any return to oppression-based governance. Unlike traditional galactic law, which had focused on maintaining stability between competing powers, the new constitution prioritized individual liberty and dignity above all other considerations. Rodriguez reviewed the constitutional provisions with satisfaction. Every sentient being was guaranteed freedom from involuntary servitude, access to education and health care, and participation in governance through democratic processes. Most importantly, the Constitution established enforcement mechanisms that could not be overridden by local tradition or economic necessity. What about resistance movements? Rodriguez asked, though intelligence reports had indicated that organized opposition to the new order was rapidly diminishing. Minimal and decreasing. Ambassador Karath reported, most former slaveholding species have discovered that free labor is actually more productive than forced labor, once you account for the costs of maintaining security and suppressing resistance. The economic arguments for slavery have collapsed along with the moral justifications. This had been one of the most surprising developments of the Reconstruction period. Galactic civilization had operated on the assumption that slave labor was economically essential, but detailed analysis revealed that the costs of maintaining oppressive systems had actually reduced overall productivity. Free beings working for fair compensation produced higher quality goods and services, while requiring minimal supervision. Chief Warrant Officer Williams, Rodriguez's intelligence coordinator, provided updates on the monitoring systems that had been established to prevent any revival of slavery. Human technology, combined with intelligence networks staffed by liberated beings, had created surveillance capabilities that made large-scale oppression effectively impossible. Sir, our monitoring stations have detected no significant violations in the past 6 months. There have been isolated incidents of individual employers attempting to impose unfair working conditions, but local authorities have been handling these situations without requiring our intervention. The development of effective local governance had been crucial to the success of Reconstruction. Rather than imposing human administrative control over the galaxy, the liberation forces had focused on establishing democratic institutions that could address problems through legitimate political processes. Rodriguez reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred across the galaxy. Species that had been locked in cycles of oppression for millennia were discovering cooperation and mutual respect. Technologies that had been developed for maintaining control over slave populations were being redirected toward exploration, education, and artistic expression. The communication system announced an incoming priority transmission from Earth. President Martinez appeared on the main display, her image showing the mix of pride and exhaustion that had characterized human leadership throughout the liberation campaign. Admiral Rodriguez, I'm calling to inform you that the Global Congress has voted to establish the Galactic Reconstruction Authority as a permanent institution. Humanity will maintain our commitment to universal freedom for as long as necessary to ensure that slavery never returns to the galaxy. The decision represented a fundamental shift in human thinking about their role in galactic affairs. What had begun as a moral response to discovered atrocities had evolved into a permanent responsibility for maintaining justice on an interstellar scale. Earth's resources would be committed indefinitely to ensuring that no being anywhere in the galaxy would again suffer the oppression that humanity had fought to end. Dr. Vasquez shared her analysis of the psychological changes that had occurred in human society as a result of their galactic mission. Admiral, our intervention has fundamentally altered human civilization as much as it has changed the galaxy. We've discovered that we cannot be truly free ourselves while others remain in bondage. The observation was profound in its implications. Humanity had begun their campaign believing they were liberating alien populations from external oppression. They had discovered instead that true freedom required universal application, that justice was indivisible, and that moral principles could not be limited by species or planetary boundaries. As Rodriguez watched the dedication ceremony proceeding below, he observed thousands of beings from hundreds of different species working together in harmony. Former slaves had become teachers, engineers, artists, and leaders. Former slaveholders had learned to find purpose in cooperation rather than domination. Children were being born into a galaxy where freedom was considered a natural right rather than a privilege to be earned. The transformation was far from complete. Generations would pass before the psychological scars of systematic oppression fully healed. Economic systems would require constant adjustment, as free societies learned to allocate resources through choice rather than compulsion. Political institutions would need continuous refinement to ensure that democracy remained responsive to the needs of all citizens. But the foundation had been established. Never again would beings be bought and sold like equipment. Never again would intelligence and creativity be suppressed in service of others' profit. Never again would the galaxy accept that some species were born to serve while others were born to rule. The ceremony concluded with the reading of the New Geneva Accords, the document that formally established the principles that would guide galactic civilization into its new era. The words were simple, but their implications would resonate throughout the galaxy for generations to come. We hold these truths to be universal, that all sentient beings are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among the sentient, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Humanity had given the galaxy something it had never possessed: hope that justice was possible, that oppression could be ended, and that freedom was not just a dream but an achievable reality for every thinking being in the universe.